Pharaoh is the leader of Egypt. And as a leader, his decisions will impact and affect every individual of Egypt. That's the importance of leadership. Because of the hardness of Pharaoh's heart, not only does Pharaoh suffer, but we're told that all of Egypt suffers. That's why leaders are so important. That's why you should care about who your leaders are. Because a leader's decision doesn't just affect that leader. The leader's decision affects everybody under him. So that's why you should pray for your leaders. You should pray for your family leaders, right? You should pray for your church leaders. I'm well aware that my decisions, they impact all of you. They even probably ripple and impact the Korean ministry of this church to an extent. But we need to be praying for even the leaders of our country. Because Pharaoh is a leader of a country. And his decisions and the hardness of his heart, it affects every individual. And we really do need to remember the importance of leadership. And we really do need to be praying for our leaders. And that's one of the reasons I make sure that we do pray the Lord's Prayer for our country and our leaders. But going back to the story, so Pharaoh, for the first time, asks Moses to plead with God on his behalf. And if he does, then Pharaoh will let the Israelites go. Moses prays, the frogs die. Again, death, right? The frogs die. But Pharaoh goes against his word and does not let the Israelites go. The third plague is the plague of gnats. Now, this plague is unique in that this is the first plague that the magicians of Egypt could not duplicate. The magicians of Egypt were not able to duplicate this plague, and the magicians in verse 19 of chapter 8 say this to Pharaoh: "This is the finger of God." Now, Pharaoh's heart is hardened, but it seems like the magicians, they're starting to be convinced that Moses' God really is God. The fourth plague is the plague of flies. This plague is unique in that this is the first plague in which God makes distinction between the people of Egypt and the people of Israel. Flies come upon the land of Egypt, but not into the land of Goshen. The land of Goshen is where the people of God live. And so in verse 22 of chapter 8, God says, "But on that day I will set apart the land of Goshen, where my people dwell, so that no swarms of flies shall be there, that you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. Thus I will put a division between my people and your people." So this is the first plague in which God makes distinction between the people of Egypt and the people of Israel. Again, Pharaoh asks Moses to plead for him. Moses does, but Pharaoh does not let the Israelites go. The fifth plague is the death of livestock. Again, there is distinction between the people of Egypt and the people of Israel. And this is real, I guess, things start getting worse. I'm not saying that fish and frogs aren't important. I was a science major in college. And we would experiment with slugs. So I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and there's lots of slugs. And so I did an experiment on snakes about body metabolism and, at what temperature that, snakes digest the food most efficiently. And we put snakes in different, but we'd feed them slugs. We just kind of feed them slugs all the time. We'd weigh everything out. And nobody ever makes a big deal about killing slugs, right? But if you try to kill a turtle, it's different. People make a big deal about turtles and rabbits, but nobody makes a big deal about slugs. It's kind of interesting. I'm just saying, right? Fish die, frogs die, but most of you probably didn't notice. They're just fish and fish and frogs. But, livestock are dying, right? It's a little bit more serious, right? You're like, oh, this is death, right? So things are getting a little bit worse here. The fifth plague is the plague of livestock and the death of the livestock. The sixth plague is the plague of boils. And so the health of the Egyptians is starting to be affected more and more. And we're actually told in verse 11 of chapter 9, the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils. For the boils came upon the magicians and upon all the Egyptians. These probably proud and once arrogant men, who tried to duplicate the plagues, all of a sudden they are the ones stricken by the plagues. You can be as arrogant and proud as you want, right, until you're stricken by God. And then when God humbles you, you know that you are not God. And God is humbling the magicians. And then the seventh plague is the plague of hail. And a lot of similarities there. God does make distinction between the Egyptians and the Israelites. Pharaoh does ask Moses to plead on his behalf. But there is death in this. There is death in this plague. If you look at verse 19, we're told, now therefore send, get your livestock and all that you have in the field into safe shelter. For every man and beast that is in the field and is not brought home will die when the hail falls on him. And then we're told in verse 25, the hail struck down everything that was in the field in all the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And the hail struck down every plant on the field and broke every tree of the field. And so when it strikes down every man and beast, it's not just talking about hitting them. We're told that if they're out in the field, they'll die. Right? So there's death as a result of this seventh plague. The eighth plague is the plague of locusts. What's interesting about this plague is in verse 17, Pharaoh calls this plague death. And so the crops that were not destroyed by the hail, they were finished off by this incredible swarm of locusts. And if you look in verse 17, when Pharaoh asks Moses to plead on his behalf, he says, now therefore forgive my sin. This is Pharaoh. Please, only this once, and plead with the Lord your God, only to remove this death from me. Pharaoh recognizes that this is death, right? The ninth plague is the plague of darkness. And the interesting thing about this darkness is that we're told that it's a deep darkness, and you can feel the darkness. And this darkness lasts for 3 days. For 3 days, this darkness lasts. But again, God makes distinction between the Egyptians and Israel. And the last plague, as you all know well, is the plague of the death of the firstborn son. There's one similarity, though, that I found very interesting about a lot of these plagues. So I'm going to move a little bit quickly. But starting with the first plague, chapter 7, we're told about the staff, right? We're told that Moses has a staff in his hand. And again, even before the first plague, there's a staff that turns into a serpent. And if you're like me, you're thinking to yourself, I'd love to see that. I'd love to see that, right? That's quite a piece of wood. That's quite a staff. That's quite a piece of wood. But again, if you look at the first plague, verse 15, verse 17, verse 19, and verse 20, we're told that go to Pharaoh in the morning, stand on the bank, and take in your hand the staff. The staff is crucial to these plagues. Very often, not for all of the plagues, but the majority of the plagues, they happen because of the staff that's in the hand. And we're told in verse 19 again, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt. So it's that phrase that really caught my attention. Take your staff and stretch out your hand. Because that phrase is actually repeated in a lot of these plagues. And that's how God shows his power. The way God shows his power over Egypt, this power to save. And this is the power to save because God is saving his people from slavery in Egypt. God demonstrates his power through the staff and through the stretching out of Moses and or Aaron's hand. Again, if you look at the second plague, in verse 5, we're told, and the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the river. And Moses does so, and the frogs come upon the land. In the third plague, if you look at verse 17, Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff, and he struck the dust, and the gnats came up. Now, in the next three, the plague of the flies, the livestock, and the boils, we're not told about the staff or the stretching out of the hand. God just does it. But then we get to the seventh, eighth, and the ninth plagues, we find that the staff appears again and the stretching out of hands. In chapter 9, in verses 22 and 23, stretch out your hand toward heaven. 23, Moses stretched out his staff toward heaven, and hail came upon the land. The eighth plague, the plague of locusts, chapter 10, verses 12 and 13, we're told about stretch out your hand over the land of Egypt. In verse 13, Moses stretched out his staff over the land of Egypt. And finally, in the ninth plague, the plague of darkness, in verses 21 and 22, stretch out your hand. So Moses stretched out his hand. Okay, I just want to prove to you that I'm not making this up. Okay, this staff and this act of stretching out of hands seems necessary for the power of God to be displayed over the Egyptians to save the people of Israel. Hopefully you agree with me. It's not a minor detail. It's not something that can be left out. It's key to the plagues. It's key. This piece of wood, this staff. And, right, this staff and this stretching out of the hands to display God's power to save his people. And a lot of us, we're amazed by these miracles. We're amazed by these plagues. They're quite amazing. If you're not, you should read them again, because they're amazing. I mean, they're legitimate miracles. A lot of us would say, wow, I wish I could have been there to see that. Man, if God did that today, do you know how many people would believe? We think that these plagues are so amazing. And let me tell you, what about that piece of wood? That staff. I don't know. Wouldn't you want that staff? I mean, that's a pretty incredible piece of wood. God demonstrates his power to save through a piece of wood and the stretching out of hands. God demonstrates his greatest power and his greatest power to save through a piece of wood and the stretching out of hands. When Jesus stretches out his hands to be crucified on a piece of wood, it is the greatest act of God's power in the history of mankind in order to save his people. And yet, we are more amazed by 10 plagues than we are by the cross of Jesus Christ. I hope that you're amazed. I hope that you're amazed by the power of God to save his people. I hope you're amazed by these 10 plagues. But I hope that you're more amazed by God's demonstration of power through Jesus Christ, through the stretching out of the hands of Christ on that piece of wood, the cross, to save us, his people. I think that is one of the secrets to living a life of faith, to being a Christian, is you can never stop being amazed by God. You can never stop being amazed by the cross of Jesus Christ and what it is that God has accomplished on that cross. Because once we stop being amazed, is when our faith starts to grow weak. Is when we just turn faith into a bunch of religious acts instead of a response of awe of who this God is. There are some of us here today that need God's salvation. There are some of us here today who are in slavery. It's not a figurative slavery. There are some of us here today that are enslaved to the very power of sin, and that we know that we are in need of salvation. And if you're anything like me, you've probably tried to save yourself many times already, but have failed terribly. To you, God lifts up this piece of wood, and he stretches out his hand on it to save you from the power of the slavery of sin. And God offers this power to you today if you would believe. Let us pray as we close today. Can we behold